On February 4, 2007, Paris Lee Bennett, a 13-year-old American boy, murdered his 4-year-old sister, Ella Bennett, in Abilene, Texas. Paris stabbed Ella 17 times as he choked and sexually assaulted her. The motive for the murder was Paris's resentment towards his mother, Charity Bennett, as he believed the best way to emotionally damage her was to take away one of her children. Paris pleaded guilty in juvenile court to capital murder, and was given the maximum sentence of 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Following the murder, Paris was diagnosed as a psychopath. The murder has gained extensive attention due to its circumstances, as well as the ages of both the perpetrator and the victim. Charity Bennett, the mother of Paris and Ella Bennett, was the daughter of Kyla Clark Bennett, a woman who was charged with conspiring to murder her husband and Charity's father, James Robert Bennett Jr. She was controversially found not guilty, and Charity believes her mother was actually guilty. During her childhood, Charity intentionally became addicted to drugs in an attempt to bring attention from her mother to her, but Kyla never showed any interest. Many suspect Kyla is a psychopath. As a child, Paris was known as charismatic and likable, and was reported to have an IQ of 141. After Paris's younger sister Ella was born, he seemed to show resentment that he was no longer the only focus of his mother's life. 1 year prior to the murder of Ella, Paris was put in a mental health facility after he had attempted to stab Charity. Shortly before the murder, Charity had relapsed into her drug addiction, and this was believed to be Paris's breaking point to what made him decide to murder Ella. On February 4, 2007, Charity hired a babysitter, as she had to work late at her job at the restaurant Buffalo Wild Wings as it was the night of the 2007 Super Bowl. Around 10 p.m., Paris was able to manipulate the babysitter and convinced her to leave the house. Later that night, sometime before 11:30 p.m., Paris entered Ella's room, choked and sexually assaulted her as he stabbed her 17 times. Following the murder, he called a school friend for about 6 minutes before deciding to call 911 at 11:42 p.m. On the call, Paris appeared to fake insanity, telling the dispatcher that he thought Ella was an inflamed pumpkin-headed demon and stabbed her. Once the dispatcher instructed Paris to perform CPR, he instead pretended he was by counting with the dispatcher as he paced around the room. Paris was later arrested sometime before 12:30 a.m. Following his arrest, Paris was charged with the capital murder of Ella. Paris was not charged as an adult, since the minimum age a juvenile can be tried as an adult in Texas is 14. He was instead charged in juvenile court and pleaded guilty to capital murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, which is the maximum sentence for a defendant convicted of capital murder in juvenile court in Texas. When he was 19, Paris was transferred to adult prison. During proceedings, Paris was diagnosed as a psychopath. He has said he has had homicidal ideation since he was a child. 8. Paris will first be eligible for parole in February 2027. If he is never granted parole, he will be released in February 2047. Charity initially maintained contact with Paris since the murder, which Paris said surprised him. Charity has been told that she and her new son are at risk once Paris is released, which she accepts and has acknowledged she will most likely need to move to a new location once Paris is released. Experts have said that it is unlikely that Paris could ever be rehabilitated. In 2021, Charity stated that she had ceased all communication with Paris, after learning he was involved with a woman who was on bond 2 hours away from where she lived, for planning a mass shooting. She stated, "I finally accepted it is okay to love him as my son, but really dislike the man he has become." In 2017, a documentary was released about the case, titled The Family I Had, focusing on Charity's life of being the daughter of a murder suspect, Kyla, and the mother of both a murderer, Paris, and a murder victim, Ella. Paris Bennett made headlines in 2019 when he gave an interview to broadcaster Piers Morgan. Paris Bennett, the boy who murdered his sister just to make his mother suffer. Texas mother learned her 4-year-old daughter Ella had been brutally murdered. The person who murdered Charity Lee's child wasn't a serial killer or known criminal. It was her 13-year-old son, Paris Bennett. Ella was stabbed 17 times and strangled by her sibling while she slept in her bed. Paris had convinced their babysitter to go home and later phoned 911 to confess to the murder. He confessed he did it to get back at his mother. ITV presenter Piers Morgan interviewed the now 25-year-old Bennett in a jail in Texas where he is serving 40 years behind bars. Having spent almost half his life in prison, he will soon be eligible for parole. With an IQ of 141, Bennett qualifies as a genius. Less than 1/4% of the world's population has that level of intelligence. As Morgan wrote in his story for Daily Mail, Bennett is also a psychopath, someone who has been formally diagnosed as a psychopath by medical experts. Echoing famous scenes from The Silence of the Lambs, Morgan met Bennett in a secure room behind reinforced glass with heavily armed guards standing by. He was told he could not speak to the killer face to face. "Why not?" Morgan asked. "He's too dangerous," came the reply. Morgan wrote, "True psychopaths have a chronic mental disorder that manifests itself in a number of personality traits including amoral or antisocial behavior, extreme egocentricity, a lack of ability to love or establish meaningful relationships, and no sense of guilt, shame or embarrassment. Psychopaths can also be quite terrifyingly violent." Paris Bennett ticks every box. The facts of the case are chilling. When he was 13, Bennett says he decided to punish his mother Charity for perceived wrongs. He planned to kill her, but instead decided to kill his 4-year-old sister Ella, effectively doubling the impact, one child dead, the other in prison. While Mother Charity was at work in a local bar, Bennett put his plan into action. He told the babysitter to leave early, then calmly walked into his sister's bedroom and began ferociously attacking her. Bennett then called a friend on the phone and talked for 6 minutes before calling the police, who came and arrested him. Lee told Morgan, "If Paris had killed me as he originally intended, I'd have only suffered for a brief few moments. But by killing Ella instead, he knew he was sentencing me to a lifetime of suffering." Incredibly, Lee says she has forgiven her son and visits him regularly. But she fears that if he is granted parole, he will torment her all over again. When asked about her son, Lee told Morgan, "He's human. He'll be nice, personable, polite. Paris is very charming when he wants to be. I mean, he's a psychopath." As Bennett walked into the secure room he announced, "Hello everyone. Since this is going to be done for ITV, would you like me to speak in the Queen's English?" He asked Morgan. "Why are you doing this interview?" Morgan asked Bennett. "To show people that I am not a monster or villain," he replied. "Can you rationalize or explain what you did to your sister?" Morgan asked. "I can't easily explain everything. I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for other people through the years, because no one likes to be confused. No one likes to be bewildered. We like easy answers." Morgan asked why he had so much fury. "For many years, there was just this hot, flaming ball of wrath in the pit of my stomach and it was directed at my mother," Bennett said. "And one of the reasons why I chose to kill my sister and not someone else is because I knew that by doing that I could hurt my mother in the worst possible way, because I had always known, as a child, that the most devastating thing to my mother would be the loss of one of her children, and I found a way to take away both her children in one fell swoop. Part of me loved my sister and would have turned the world upside down for her. But there was a part, wounded, twisted, dark, the part that had been in pain for so long. Misery loves company," he said. "I love her, Ella, with every fiber of my being." When asked by Morgan if he knew what love is, Bennett replied, "I don't know how to answer that question. It's not simple. I can't just point at something and say, okay, that's love. I recognize it and feel that." Bennett was then asked if he would kill again. "The only person I'm dangerous to is myself because the very moment I feel the chains slipping and the bars bending, the very moment I detect that dark part of myself coming back out again, I would remove myself from the equation. Every single person walking around has it in him or her to commit murder." Margaret Atwood once wrote that if we were all on trial for our thoughts, we would all be hanged. Bennett admitted the truth. He had planned the murder and considered murdering his mom too. He said the first reason he didn't go ahead with it was because it was a lot harder to kill someone than he thought, Lee said previously. The second reason was the realization if he'd killed me, I only would have suffered for 5, 10, 15 minutes. But, if he left me alive, without Ella, I would suffer for the rest of my life. My son is a monster, and because he is a monster, I have lost my daughter. Lee was never in denial that her son might kill her one day. But the realization really sunk in when he attacked her in the visitor's room in jail. He slammed the table into me, pinning me against the concrete wall behind me. He cut off my air. I was in shock, paralyzed. I thought I was going to die there, she wrote on April 14, 2007. Then he pulled the table back, I caught my breath, and he slammed it into me again. Bennett, who was sentenced to 40 years in prison, continues to try and hurt Lee throughout the book, saying things like, "By the way, I enjoy watching your pain." Meanwhile, Lee tried to suss out where his animosity came from, wondering if her brief drug relapse may have had a deeper effect on him than she thought. A former heroin addict, Lee was clean for 12 years, but she slipped into her old ways with cocaine when her son was 12 and Ella was 3. Paris was angry with me. He had every right to be. It was a really hard time for us both, she writes of the 6-month period before getting sober again. So, did my relapse turn Paris into a murderer? Murder runs in the family. When Lee was 6, her mother was charged with killing her father, but was later acquitted, she explains. To cope with the crushing sadness of losing both her kids, Lee began to write down her thoughts. She also resorted to heavy drinking and even attempted suicide several times by overdosing on sleeping pills. But through years of self-reflection, Lee was able to forgive her son and accept him for who he is. My son is a psychopath. I can't help him. That may not matter in the long run. What may matter is I can't, not at this point, give up on him either, she writes. I love my firstborn with as much intensity as I have since the day I found out I was pregnant with him. Her deep introspection also helped her to grieve the loss of her guardian angel, who she lovingly calls Ella Bella. Ever since the tragic incident, Lee associates her daughter with butterflies, since it was the last painting she made in school. A friend also found a butterfly brooch in her backyard on the same day she returned to her home after the murder. The book ends in 2011, the same year she founded the non-profit Ella Foundation, which stands for Empathy, Love, Lessons and Action, which helps people affected by violence, mental illness and the criminal justice system. A year later, she gave birth to a son, Phoenix. I am happy to report that today Phoenix is a happy, affectionate, intelligent, stubborn and opinionated 6-year-old, she writes in the epilogue. She is also open and honest about who his brother is and sometimes allows them to speak on the phone. Critics of mine like to disparage me for allowing Paris to speak to Phoenix, she writes. They tell me what a horrible mother I am for allowing the child who murdered my child to speak to my other child. To them she has one retort. I am setting an example for Phoenix. An example of how unconditional love and forgiveness look and behave.